You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.
And so by the time Jefferson is making his claim in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, what he's saying is both strategic but also misleading. Because essentially, he's right in the sense that he's saying Britain has enabled the conditions that have allowed for the expansion of slavery in North America. The British monarchy has played a role in this through things like supporting these slave trading companies, defending the monopolies of these companies, benefiting from the customs revenue, issuing proclamations, encouraging people, English subjects and eventually British subjects, to buy land and to invest in coerced laborers. But the misleading aspect of this is that by the time we get to the lead up to the American Revolution, racial slavery is deeply entrenched in colonial American society. Economies are completely wrapped up in this.
Hello, and welcome to episode 440 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The Declaration of Independence is perhaps the most iconic founding document in United States history. After its famous preamble, where it declared life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Declaration contains a list of grievances against King George III that serve as the reasons why the 13 British North American colonies left the British Empire. Do you know how many grievances Thomas Jefferson wrote into his draft of the Declaration of Independence? If you answered 27, you're thinking about the grievances that the Second Continental Congress included in its final signed draft of the Declaration. But Thomas Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration contained one more, a final and controversial grievance that Congress chose not to include in its final draft, and that was Jefferson's grievance about slavery. In this cut grievance, Jefferson accused King George III of waging cruel war against human nature itself by trafficking enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, forcing slavery onto unwilling American colonists, and then, after the Revolution began, inciting those same enslaved people to rise up and kill their enslavers. In many ways, this grievance represents some of the most explosive lines that Thomas Jefferson ever wrote, but Congress struck them out and chose not to adopt them. So 250 years later, we're left with the question of whether Jefferson's claims had any merit. Did King George III and the British monarchy really bear responsibility for slavery in the 13 colonies? Or was Thomas Jefferson's grievance a strategic sleight of hand, an attempt to pin a uniquely American system onto the crown that he and other Americans wanted to escape from? Brooke Newman, an associate professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University and author of the book The Crown's Silence, The History of the British Monarchy and Slavery, joins us to explore the truths in Jefferson's claim. Now, during our investigation, Brooke reveals how England elbowed its way into the transatlantic slave trade under Queen Elizabeth I, and why for more than a century it was the British Crown, not Parliament, that bankrolled the expansion of English slaving. Why King George III's own commonplace notebooks show him as being privately skeptical of slavery's moral justifications, even as he refused to let colonies like Virginia curb the international slave trade, and what Dunmore's proclamation actually was, how much it had to do with King George III, and why it cannot be read as a royal act of emancipation. But first, before we dive in today, a personal note. Ben Franklin's World keeps going because of the people who believe in it, listeners like you and the sponsors who help make this work possible, which is why I want to come to you first. If you run a business, lead a brand, or know someone who does, and you'd like to reach an audience of curious readers, educators, writers, and lifelong learners, I'd love to have a conversation with you about sponsoring this show. Our listeners are thoughtful, engaged, and deeply connected to this community. They show up every week because they trust what we do together. And that trust extends to the partners we choose, which is why fit matters so much. I'm looking for sponsors who can bring real value to our audience and who are excited to reach them. So if this sounds like you, please reach out at benfranklinsworld.com/sponsor. That's benfranklinsworld.com/sponsor. All right, Are you ready to explore the Declaration's cut grievance? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is an associate professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University. She's a historian of early modern Britain and the British Atlantic world. Her research expertise is in the history of slavery, the abolition movement, and the British royal family. She's an award-winning author. Her first book, A Dark Inheritance, Blood, Race, and Sex in Colonial Jamaica, received a gold medal for world history and was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Today, she joins us to explore details from her newest book, The Crown's Silence, The Hidden History of the British Monarchy and Slavery. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Brooke Newman.
Thank you for having me. Love this podcast.
Now, by way of an introduction for our conversation today, it's important to know that Thomas Jefferson and the Committee of Five wrote a draft of the Declaration of Independence that did not look like the final version of the Declaration that the Second Continental Congress issued. That final version of the Declaration included 27 grievances against the British Crown. And these grievances are what laid the framework for why the 13 British North American colonies sought independence from Great Britain. Now, one grievance that Thomas Jefferson wrote into his draft that never made it into the final version of the Declaration was a charge that King George III was not only responsible for slavery in North America, but after having denied freedom to African and African American enslaved people, he was urging them to fight for their freedom by killing their enslavers during the American War for Independence. Brooke, Thomas Jefferson wrote this claim. He wanted this grievance that King George III and Great Britain were responsible for slavery in the Americans' Declaration for Independence. And I've always kind of wondered about the truth of this claim, because if Jefferson wrote it, he thought that this was a claim on which the United States can stand on, then there must be some truth to it. But the question of whether King George III and Parliament were responsible for slavery in North America has really seemed too big to investigate. But with your new book, The Crown's Silence, we can consider this question, because you take such a long, detailed view of the history of the British Crown and its role in the international slave trade. So, would you tell us how you came to this topic, the intertwined history of the British Crown and slavery?
I came to this topic after writing my first book, A Dark Inheritance, and researching the history of slavery and Britain's role in the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade and colonial slavery, primarily in the Caribbean, but also in colonial America. And I was really fascinated by the changing role of the British monarchs over time, particularly as their constitutional position shifted. So in the Tudor and Stuart period, they had far more power, which they tried to exercise. And then by the 18th century, after the Glorious Revolution, Parliament really reigned supreme, and the monarchs have far less political power and much more symbolic power. And yet there was no book essentially out there that looked at the evolution of the monarchy's role and involvement in the expansion of slavery, in the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, and even up until the American Revolution and beyond. I was very curious, what role really did they play? And so that was what I set out to do, was essentially write the book that I wanted to read. And initially I thought it would just focus on George III and his reign, because that was really where I started. But as I was working on this project, I realized there was a much larger story here, a story that went all the way back to the Tudors and Queen Elizabeth and all the way up to essentially emancipation. And so that is the book that I wrote. And I do see it really as the beginning of a conversation about this topic. I think there'll be many more books and studies that will come out, and that we will continue to be presented with new revelations going forward on this topic.
Now, before we dive more fully into our conversation and investigation of the international slave trade and whether it was the cause of the American Revolution and Americans' decision to seek independence, I wonder if we could talk a bit about the dates and terminology that we'll be discussing. Brooke, you mentioned Tudor and Stuart England. Can you give us a period for those periods? And what do we mean when we say the English crown or the British crown? Because we're going to be talking a lot about that institution.
When we talk about the Tudor monarchs, we're talking about basically the beginning of the Tudor dynasty with Henry VII, all the way up until the death of Queen Elizabeth, which is in 1603. And so it's a little over 100 years when the Tudors are in power. And then essentially the Stuart monarchs replace the Tudors after the death of Queen Elizabeth with James I, and then his son, Charles I, who ends up getting his head cut off. And then there's a brief intermission with the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. And then we have the later Stuart monarchs, Charles II, James II, William and Mary, and then Anne. And so they really form the Stuart dynasty. And then in the 18th century, there is a new dynasty that is German, but still related to the Tudor Stuart monarchs, and that is the Hanoverian dynasty. And that is the dynasty that George III is part of. And his reign, which is really the longest reign, particularly in this story, lasts from 1760 to 1820. And so he is on the throne during the height of the transatlantic slave trade, during the beginning of the agitation of the abolition movement in Parliament and beyond, and also when the slave trade is actually abolished in 1807, he's on the throne. And then ultimately, there's a regency period during the last 9 years of his life where he is really only nominally king. And actually, it's his son, George, Prince of Wales, who is the regent and essentially kind of in charge of the country.
So we're talking about the 16th through the 18th centuries, or the 1500s through the 1700s. And I think that's important to know because Thomas Jefferson took some liberties with the timeline when he drafted the Declaration. And yet Jefferson knew his English history. So when he drafted the Grievance about slavery, he wrote that King George III, quote, has waged a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty, and the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them off into slavery and another hemisphere, end quote. Brooke, we know the slave trade existed before King George III, but Jefferson seemed to start the trade with George III in this cut grievance from the Declaration of Independence. So when did the international slave trade and the British monarchy's connection to it actually start?
So it begins in a very sporadic, opportunistic way under the Tudors. And what's kind of fascinating, I think, to realize is that in the 16th century, England is in many ways a backwater. It is a minor European power. It is not a major player on the world stage. And someone like Queen Elizabeth, who's come to the throne, she is Protestant and she is a woman, and her treasury is virtually empty. She's also inherited a fairly modest navy of only about 34 vessels. She doesn't have a lot of power and she doesn't have a lot of military capacity, but she has a rising merchant community, a community of essentially commercial and seafaring men who are very interested in global trade and in expanding English horizons beyond Europe. And so they're looking to places like West Africa, the Americas, the Caribbean, and they really are very interested in essentially getting involved in any kind of contraband trade with the Spanish Empire in the Americas, because there is so much wealth being extracted from the Americas by the Spanish. And the Iberian powers, including the Portuguese, are benefiting from this. The Portuguese are the primary carriers of enslaved Africans to the Spanish Empire. They own, at the time, the Asiento contract, which enables them to legally trade in enslaved people with Spain and with Spanish colonists. The English, they don't have the capacity. Not only do they not have colonies yet in the Americas to where they'd even want to be engaging in buying coerced laborers, they don't have any kind of legal trade set up. In fact, Philip II, who is King of Spain, does not want the English anywhere near his empire in the Americas. But you've got enterprising, entrepreneurial merchants like John Hawkins in the 1560s, who decides essentially that he's going to make money off of engaging in an illicit slave trade. And he does this initially on his own steam, and he ends up capturing people in West Africa and trading them to Spanish colonists, and he makes an enormous amount of money, and he comes back to England, and the Queen and her court hear about this. They hear about the success of this voyage, and so she essentially begins by loaning him one of the largest warships in her Royal Navy, which is the Jesus of Lubeck, and this is a 700-ton warship. This is a massive warship. And so for Hawkins, it's a really big deal to get this ship to be able to fly the royal standard at will if he wants to claim that he's acting under the authority of the Queen of England. and essentially engage in this trade, which he is hoping to actually establish. He's not actually engaging it in a piratical manner in the sense that he just wants to make money and get out of there. He wants to establish an English slave trade. However, ultimately, this does not work out. The Spanish really smack the English down. Hawkins' third voyage ends in disaster. The fleet is practically destroyed off of Veracruz. And he ends up kind of limping back to England with not much to show for his efforts at the end of the 1560s. But what he's established and what essentially the Queen has gotten out of this initial foray into the transatlantic slave trade is the realization that there is a lot of money to be made, not only in the African trade, in coveted products like pepper and other spices, and a dye wood, a redwood that was used to produce red dye in Europe, high quality dye, in things like wax and ivory, obviously gold, but also in enslaved people, in people as commodities. So this is something that they're aware of. And even though it takes them a number of decades to really launch into the transatlantic slave trade on a larger scale, the English are highly aware of the fact that there is money to be made not only in trade overseas, but also in colonies. And so that is why by the time we get to the end of the Elizabethan era and into the early Stuart era, we see attempts to plant colonies. The first one fails, but eventually they have Jamestown and they start eventually profiting off of tobacco. And then there is colonies that are planted in the Caribbean. And this makes an enormous difference to England's involvement in the slave trade. Because then there is the Guinea Company, which is another company that is a monopoly company granted a charter by King James in 1618. That charter is then renewed by Charles I in 1631. Initially, they really are hoping to find gold, and they actually waste a lot of resources and money and time trying to find gold that they don't find. But by the 1630s and then even into the 40s, the empire itself is beginning to take shape in the Atlantic world, and they are starting to realize, again, money can be made through providing slaves, enslaved people to the colonies in the Americas. And so the Guinea Company gets embroiled in the slave trade as well. But it's facing a lot of competition from Dutch traders, from French traders, even from the Portuguese. And so by the time Charles II comes to the throne in 1660, this is with the restoration of the Stuart monarchy, it is very clear to the king, to members of the merchant community, to the political elites and the landed aristocracy that the way to make money is, number one, to invest in empire and imperial expansion in a territorial sense, but also in a commercial sense. And then secondly, to invest directly in England's own transatlantic slave trade, which is what ultimately King Charles does. Within 6 months of taking the throne, he is handing out another monopoly charter to the royal adventurers. And this is a group of people, many of them are either members of the royal family or members of the aristocracy, and they are investing in this company initially, again, with hopes of trading in a wide variety of different African commodities and also finding gold mines. But really rapidly, they realize where the money is at is in people, in human commodities. And this is something that they shift to very quickly. And in 1663, when they are issued a new monopoly charter, it very explicitly addresses that this company will have total and complete control over the transatlantic slave trade. So this is all a very long process. It is not the kind of process that you can look at and say, okay, in 1564, this happened, and then 3 years later, this happened. Instead, it is a process that happens in fits and starts. And this has everything to do with the geopolitical context, but also with the financial situation, that these monarchs just do not have the money to actually launch England into the slave trade until there is an expanded merchant community that can help them with this. But also, and I mentioned this in my book, there is a really pivotal moment with Oliver Cromwell in the Commonwealth era because he's basically launched the country as a republic and he needs to defend it. And so Parliament and Cromwell build and radically expand the Navy. And so when Charles comes to the throne in 1660, he has inherited a greatly expanded Navy. And this is something that he can use. He's got this at his disposal He is immediately able to loan vessels to a new upstart slave trading company stocked with supplies and men to initiate the transatlantic slave trade. He's also able to deploy warships to defend the shipping lanes between places like West Africa and the Caribbean, and then ultimately the Chesapeake. And so there's a multi-pronged strategy going on here where you've got people investing, but there's also the sort of material conditions in place to make it possible in the 1660s to really expand the transatlantic slave trade. But it is in a lot of ways a long story that does begin a century earlier.
Your point that we need to remember that by the start of the 17th century, the 1600s, England was just a backwater that didn't really have an army or navy or any money in its treasury is really important because England at this time does exist in the world of the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas. And in that treaty, the Pope gave the Portuguese the exclusive right to trade and colonize in the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Spanish the exclusive right to trade and colonize in the Western Hemisphere. And it's in that Western Hemisphere that England really wants to belong to. But as a Protestant country and a backwater, they were excluded from this papal declaration. So England really had to elbow its way into the Atlantic trade. And I think that's a different perspective for us to think about because by the time we talk about the American Revolution in the 1770s, that was a British Atlantic world where there's a lot of British trade happening. And we know that it has a lot of colonies in that world. So your point that the English Atlantic trade didn't start that way with England being a power in the beginning, that's really important for us to consider, especially as the way that England developed its strength and power in the region in this trade was through the transatlantic slave trade.
And then going back to the question, which I realized I forgot to answer about what do we mean when we talk about the crown? That's a really important question because originally my book was called The Queen's Silence. And ultimately, I changed it to The Crown's Silence. And partly that was pragmatic because Queen Elizabeth was dead. And so it didn't make a lot of sense to call it The Queen's Silence. But also really thinking about the longue durée here, this is very much an institutional story. The crown is the institution of the monarchy and what is inherited over time. It transcends any individual monarch or any individual preference of a monarch. And so in the book, there are moments when I say the Duke of York, for example, the younger brother of Charles II, who becomes James II, he personally invests and profits in the transatlantic slave trade. We know that. But he also, as monarch, ends up benefiting financially from the transatlantic slave trade, from the Royal African Company itself, and also from the expansion of slavery in his Atlantic empire, because many of the goods that are worth an enormous amount of money that are re-exported away from England and eventually Britain are produced by enslaved labor. And so that customs revenue that comes in forms a huge percentage of the ordinary income of the monarch as early as the 1680s. And so this is a story about the institution itself and how, yes, even as it changes over time and as the power of the institution declines, it's still benefiting from slavery in ways that are in some ways hard to quantify and almost hard to even track. You know, how do you track over hundreds and hundreds of years how an institution benefited? And I think that one of the ways that you do that is by looking at key themes, which is what I do in the book. So things like looking at customs revenue, how much money was made off of the transatlantic slave trade and off of slave-produced colonial products, looking at investments. What do they invest in and how much? We know they invested in multiple slave trading companies. They also did things like favors for these companies. Charles II appointed his brother James, Duke of York. Essentially, he's head of the Royal Adventurers and then ultimately the Royal African Company. He is the governor, he's the largest shareholder, but he's also Lord High Admiral, which means in consultation with the king, he has control over the deployment of royal naval vessels. And so essentially, he could bother his brother and say, the Royal African Company needs support in the form of warships to help protect the shipping lanes. And so that protection is a key way that the monarchy is investing in slavery, but also using its resources at its disposal as an institution to protect slaving and expand it.
And this is one of the things that I found so striking about your book, The Crown's Silence, because you do have a lot of information about the economics of monarchy. Elizabeth I and really James I, so the last Tudor and first Stuart monarchs, they had near absolute control of the treasury. Parliament was not controlling the purse strings of England yet. But Parliament did claim more and more control every time the monarch asked them for a loan or taxes to be levied. And so gradually the absolute powers of the monarch over the treasury were reined in because the monarch needed Parliament's approval to access and raise money for their agendas. And in part, Charles I was executed because he kept trying to circumvent and resist Parliament's growing control over England's finances. And so by the time you get to James I's grandsons, Charles II and James II, by the time they ascend the throne, Parliament, because of Cromwell, really did control the purse strings of the English government. And so, as you were saying, Brooke, it felt really important for James II to become really involved in these African slave trading companies because those companies were a way to add money to his personal coffers, grow his personal wealth, and to support the monarch's lavish lifestyles.
Yes, absolutely. And that is exactly why people were outraged with the Stuarts. Not only were they giving monopoly charters out kind of left and right, every time they give a company a monopoly, the company gives them money. So they're profiting off of essentially creating all of these companies. And that's one of the things that Phil Stern argues in his book about how corporations help to create empire. And what's fascinating about the Stuart era is that it's the monarchy and corporations working hand in hand, essentially, in this earlier period to essentially expand empire, to profit from empire, and to do all of these backroom deals, essentially, to the benefit only of the monarchy and subscribers in these various corporations, these joint stock companies. So there are a number of people in the larger trading community in the Stuart era, so the late 17th century, who are outraged by this. They're outraged by the fact that Charles II and his brother are using the Navy to defend a monopoly company that they are profiting from personally, which is then enabling them not to have to call Parliament. Not initially, it takes time for them to really profit off of this whole deal, but eventually they do. And also Charles II, he's borrowing money from the King of France, secretly. And so he is doing all of these things to sort of push the royal prerogative to the limit in order to have more power. And that is seen as deeply problematic, especially after everything that happened with Charles I and his willful disregard of any kind of constitutional limits on his authority. But then also there's the religious aspects of this story, which is that Charles II is sort of secretly leaning toward Catholicism. His brother, even before his elder brother is dead, converts to Catholicism and it becomes like an open secret and everyone knows. So then there's this concern about we've got this potential next monarch with absolutist tendencies, in addition to the fact that he's Catholic. And by then, the English strongly associate Catholicism with tyranny and with abuse of liberty, and essentially with not respecting the rights of your subjects and potentially destroying the whole identity of the English nation after it had evolved and was really formed under the crucible of fights with Spain and, the Protestant Reformation and everything that happened under the Tudor and early Stuart era. So there's a lot going on in the late 17th century. And I think the whole story is a truly fascinating story in the sense that slavery and the slave trade, obviously that was what I was interested in, but it's one aspect of a much larger story about the limits of royal power and about royal abuses of power and how they all come to a head during the Stuart era. And this one company, the Royal African Company, there's all of these pamphlets that are published about how this company in its abuses represents everything that's wrong with monarchy as a system. And then when we get 100 years later to the American Revolution, it's fascinating to think that, again, slavery is part of these conversations. Even if it doesn't ultimately make it into the Declaration of Independence, it's still there. It's still part of this larger narrative about potential abuse of power. And it also, in many ways, is strategic in the sense that even these arguments about you're making money off of slavery in the Stuart era, it's because they want to make money off of slavery too. It is not because they're against slavery. This is not an abolitionist argument against somebody like James II and his abuse of power. Instead, it is from others who want in on the action independent traders. They want a piece of this pie.
Well, this economic review of history reminds us that the British monarchs certainly stood to benefit privately from the slave trade because of the way they wrote all of those contracts and the way they stood to personally profit from holding shares in these slave trading companies, which is actually a really important component of whether George III is actually to blame for the slave trade and slavery in British North America. But we should move on to the point that you made earlier, Brooke, about how the colonies were structured for slavery. Would you tell us about the international slave trade, how that developed, and how the English colonies were established for slavery?
What's interesting to know, I think, and especially given the debate around this during the American Revolution or in the lead up to the American Revolution, is that when you look at what will become the 13 colonies and then the Caribbean colonies, initially, there are a number of people who want to get involved in coerced labor of some sort, whether it is eventually indigenous coerced labor or indentured servitude, which has a limited amount of time where you've got coercion going involved in that, or hereditary racial slavery, which is the transatlantic slave trade and the ultimate system of African slavery that evolves. And in the Caribbean, in places like Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands, they are getting, in the 17th century, the vast majority of the deliveries of enslaved captives from all sorts of different traders, but especially from the Royal African Company. Because that is where the factors, or the people who essentially are in place to receive incoming shipments of enslaved people, are based, because that is the number one place that they go. And actually, Greg O'Malley's book, Final Passages, is a really great primer on how that system operated, that Barbados was the first port of call. Planters and enslavers, wannabe enslavers in the Chesapeake region, for example, are not happy about this because they want increased shipments of enslaved people coming to, Virginia and Maryland and elsewhere. They want to get more coerced laborers to help enable and facilitate the expansion of tobacco production and all kinds of other production that ends up going on in the Chesapeake region. And so eventually, after it loses its monopoly, because Parliament in 1698 ends up opening up the transatlantic slave trade to independent traders as well as the Royal African Company, initially they have to provide some money to support the forts that have already been put in place along the West African coast that the Royal African Company maintains. But later on, that's sort of done away with. And this leads to an explosion of transatlantic slave trading. It also greatly increases the number of shipments of enslaved people that are arriving in the Chesapeake. And so what's important to know is that the era of the monopoly, Royal African Company, slave trading era, not that many people are actually brought to mainland North America. Most of them are going to places like Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leeward Islands. But this is the 18th century where they are benefiting directly from the expansion of this trade and then all of these different networks, because then you've got independent traders who have people in place to receive shipments all up and down the eastern seaboard in mainland North America, as well as in places like Jamaica and Barbados. And so ultimately, by the time when Thomas Jefferson is thinking about his grievances and when Virginia is actually thinking about trying to limit the transatlantic slave trade, they've already benefited decades before. They demanded more, they got what they wanted, and then ultimately they discovered that their enslaved population could actually reproduce itself over the decades, which contrasted dramatically from places like Jamaica, where 90% of the population was enslaved, but this population was replenished through the transatlantic slave trade because the mortality rates were so incredibly high. And so it sets up in many ways a world in which they've forgotten about this earlier era where they were desperate for more laborers, where they desperately wanted more enslaved Africans to be coming to mainland North America to help kickstart tobacco production and then ultimately cotton and then rice and other types of production in mainland North America. And so by the time Jefferson is making his claim in the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, what he's saying is both strategic but also misleading, because essentially he's right in the sense that he's saying Britain has enabled the conditions that have allowed for the expansion of slavery in North America. The British monarchy has played a role in this through things like supporting these slave trading companies, defending the monopolies of these companies, benefiting from the customs revenue, issuing proclamations encouraging people, English subjects and eventually British subjects, to buy land and to invest in coerced laborers, and also by rubber stamping the legislation that these southern slaveholding colonies end up passing. That legislation goes back to England and could have been rejected as being repugnant to English law, but instead it is approved. And so there is this process whereby it's happening on both sides of the Atlantic, but the sort of misleading aspect of this is that by the time we get to the lead up to the American Revolution, racial slavery is deeply entrenched in colonial American society. Economies are completely wrapped up in this. And even northern colonies are benefiting from the transatlantic slave trade and from all sorts of commercial ties that also are connected to slavery. And the British economy itself is benefiting as well from the slave trade, from all of the industries connected to the slave trade. So shipping, insurance and underwriting, sailors. There's just so many different ways that people are benefiting from this larger Atlantic slaving network. So it's a much more complicated story. And I think it makes sense that it was cut from the final version of the Declaration because it didn't really make sense to put that in. And it was disingenuous because it essentially placed responsibility on a monarch who came to the throne when this system had been around for 100 years, and a monarch who actually was constitutionally restrained in a number of ways by the late 18th century. So you wouldn't see somebody like George III ending slavery or ending the slave trade. He didn't have that power.
Well, before we dive into King George III and his thoughts on slavery, I wonder if we could talk about how the slave trade operated by the time of the American Revolution. So you've mentioned, Brooke, how enslaved people were shipped by the English slave trading companies from Africa to Barbados, which then served as a gateway or transshipment center for slavery into British North America. And Jefferson noted in his drafted Grievance that King George III, quote, captivated and carried Africans into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transshipment thither. This is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, end quote. I wonder if you could talk more about the logistics of the slave trade, from the triangle trade of goods that many of us have heard about, to the different types of insurance and other businesses that developed around the slave trade by the time of the American Revolution.
I will say, just because I think it's a really great book, that Nicholas Radburn has a book called Traders and Men, and it is entirely about that question, about the logistics. And one of the things that he argues in that book is that this whole system relied upon men, and they were men, willing to operate this system in West Africa, set up in these different coastal factories. So, for example, the primary English factory was Cape Coast Castle, and that was situated in what is now modern-day Ghana on the Gold Coast. This was the largest factory. It also was a central outport where various African kingdoms would bring people from inland areas, because the English, one thing I think it's really important to know is that they rarely penetrated inland. They relied upon negotiations with rulers of various African kingdoms. And those kingdoms and the different regions that dominated changed over time. So during, for example, the Stuart era, the Gold Coast region was predominant, that area of modern-day Ghana. And that is where they concentrated a lot of their efforts, and also in Sierra Leone, Senegambia region. But as we get into the 18th century and the trade is opened, it leads to geographical diversification. And this actually ends up kind of pushing the English into different regions where there are more enslaved people on offer, because that is also what they're looking at. So, for example, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, these are in modern day Benin, Togo, and Nigeria, and then also in Nigeria and Cameroon, in those regions. And they're still trading in the Gold Coast and in Sierra Leone, but not as much. They're essentially going to where there are enslaved people available. And one of the reasons why they're available is because there are people to buy. So there's both demand from European enslavers who are coming in record numbers in the 18th century to West Africa. And they're there. Yes, they want a variety of products, but what they primarily want is enslaved people. And so different African kingdoms have essentially learned that this is the way to maintain power, to conduct warfare and provide captives, but also to create stability. Because let's say you are actually the leader of an African kingdom, you are not going to be able to maintain your position in this larger Atlantic network unless you are getting involved in the transatlantic slave trade. It's just not feasible in the 18th century. And so one of those questions that I think comes up a lot is, what about Africans? Africans were involved in this process, but of course they were. What else would they do? They were operating within an Atlantic exchange economy, and they had items that they coveted as well. So things like textiles, and these were re-exported textiles like Indian textiles from India, as well as English woolen goods or cotton goods, eventually from the Manchester region in England, as well as things like firearms, gunpowder, brass, all sorts of other goods that they are bringing in, and in exchange, they are sending out captives. Whereas before the transatlantic slave trade became this huge global business, many captives in these different African kingdoms would have been reabsorbed on a domestic level and eventually would have essentially formed their own kinship networks in some of these different local communities. But when they are shipped out to the Americas, they are shipped out into a completely different system. And Stephanie Smallwood's book, Saltwater Slavery, as well as Marcus Rediker's book, The Slave Ship, both talk about that process of essentially, and the logistics of slavery, thinking about you've got various kingdoms warring over territory and power, getting captives, bringing them to European slavers who then take them and disperse them, sometimes to places like South America. That's what the South Sea Company did, or to the Caribbean or to the Chesapeake region. And they're doing this in order to make a great deal of money, but they're also commodifying people in the process of the Middle Passage. It could be up to a 3-month-long voyage. Mortality rates were high. There was always potential for rebellion at sea. The ships that were used were a mix of merchant vessels that were repurposed for the transatlantic slave trade. And then there were, in the 18th century, ships that were designed specifically for the transatlantic slave trade, known as Guineamen. And these vessels essentially were created with the slave trade in mind so that they could maximize the number of people that they had in the holds of the ship. There was ventilation, but you can imagine the conditions were horrendous. And so the ventilation was just the bare minimum to ensure survival. They were armed in case of rebellion, but also in case of piracy. So the process itself is extremely complicated because you've got all of these different players. And then there's also protection that is provided by the British government in the form of the warships. And so they are protecting the slave trade for centuries. And what I think so interesting is that in Britain now, especially as this topic has become a part of public consciousness, the question of what role did the British play in the slave trade? What about abolition? The primary emphasis is always on the Royal Navy as essentially liberating Africans, liberating enslaved Africans from slaving vessels in the 19th century after the abolition of the British transatlantic slave trade. And while that is true, there's also centuries that came before where the Royal Navy was actually playing a critical role in assisting in the transport of enslaved people. And so this is just an evolution, really, of the Royal Navy's role in this long process and much larger story. And even when they're liberating enslaved Africans in the early 19th century, they're also bringing them back to either Sierra Leone or somewhere else where they're going to be conscripted into the British imperial forces and essentially forced to work off this freedom that they have been given, this nominal freedom in the name of the king.
Okay, now that we know how the international slave trade worked, let's take a moment for our episode sponsor and then bring it back to King George III. What Brooke is helping us see, that slavery in British North America wasn't a crime imported from Westminster. but a system that American colonists had built, demanded, and profited from for over a century before the Declaration of Independence. That's a kind of history you can only tell with original sources. Royal correspondence, treasury ledgers, the commonplace notebooks of a young Prince of Wales, those are kept in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. So for those records, Brooke's research centered deep into the British archives. But the American side of this same Atlantic story lives on the North American side of the ocean as well. It's a story that lives within the archives of our sponsor, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791. When Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration reached the Committee of Five, John Adams was in the room. And the papers that Adams left behind, his correspondence, his journal, his autobiography, those family records of the debates and votes that shaped the Declaration, they live in the Adams family papers at the MHS. So do the letters of Massachusetts merchants whose fortunes were tied to the same Atlantic trade that Brooke has been describing. And so do the manuscripts that recorded the growing anti-slavery voices in New England. These aren't footnotes. They're the primary historical record on the American side of the story. It's a record that lets us ask and answer the harder questions that Brooke has raised about American complicity in the slave trade. That's what historical societies like the MHS do. They hold the papers, the images, and the objects from the past that make our history books possible. Now, our partnership with the MHS helps us bring you more of this kind of work and keeps our content freely available. But there's another part of what makes this podcast possible, and that's you. Ben Franklin's World has been going on for nearly 12 years, and it's always been a community effort. So if this show has become part of your routine, if you found yourself going down a rabbit hole because of a conversation you heard here, I'd love for you to consider supporting us. You can make a tax-deductible donation at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. Every bit of support helps, so thank you. Thank you for listening, for caring about this work, and for helping us to keep it going. And a sincere thank you to Judith D., William D., Jeffrey D., Rose D., Robert D., and Nancy and Eric D. for your generous support. It means more than you can know. Thank you. Brooke, King George III has gone down in history as an enlightened king because he was highly educated and he was very interested in all sorts of scientific and natural phenomena. But when you read The Crown's Silence, you get the feeling that George III started as ambivalent towards slavery and the slave trade, and then later became supportive of slavery. So would you tell us about King George III's education during the Enlightenment and about his real views on slavery?
Yes, I think King George III had in some ways classical Enlightenment, royal education, in that he was trained in the classics. He was reading Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, which was a classic Enlightenment text. And he was doing this when he was Prince of Wales under the tutelage of Lord Bute, who was his tutor. And he was trained at a young age to see himself as a British monarch. He was the first Hanoverian monarch to be born in England and spoke English fluently. And he saw himself as someone who was going to be a patriot king, who was going to represent the interests of his subjects and of his empire. And that he also was inheriting this empire that he needed to protect and defend and potentially expand. And so that type of education also overlapped a bit uneasily with what he was thinking and learning about slavery and the slave trade. For example, in Montesquieu, Montesquieu famously in Book 15 writes about essentially the excuses that had been used to justify slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And he uses irony to do this in satire. But at the end of the day, he's essentially pointing out that there are no real legitimate excuses, that there's no justification in natural law for slavery. He does distinguish a little bit between like temperate climates, as he would have phrased it at the time. So essentially what they would have seen as European Christian civilization. There's absolutely no excuse for slavery in those areas. But then in so-called hot climates, in like Africa or the Caribbean would have been an example, still there's really no justification other than, well, maybe some people are lazy and they need to be coerced to labor. So he's kind of ambivalent in that sense. But when George is reading about this as a young Prince of Wales, it's clear from his commonplace notebooks, which are kept in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, that he agrees with Montesquieu that he doesn't see there as being any justification for slavery, and particularly for African slavery. But at the same time, he lives in a world that is pragmatic. He views the world in a pragmatic way. He knows that he's going to be essentially the king of an empire. And the way to maintain that empire is through its slave trade and through its investment in coerced labor, and also through the commitments it's made to its colonial subjects in terms of property, including human property. And that is one of the points I think that really stands out to me when I look at the correspondence of George III and his notes over many decades. So throughout his entire life, he strongly believed that the British had essentially made a kind of deal with colonists, and that was that they were going to honor their property rights. And, this becomes a huge point of contention in the American Revolution, because if you're honoring our property rights, well, then why are you taxing us without representation? And, how does that make sense? But in his mind, he believed that if he took enslaved people away or he got rid of the slave trade, that this would actually be going against all the promises that both the monarchy and parliament had made over the years to colonists. And so I think in his own mind, he was probably a little ambivalent about the moral justifications for all of this. But at the same time, he was very much committed to defending his empire. And as he says multiple times during the American Revolution in his notes, he did not want Britain to fall lower in the ranks of essentially kind of global powers. And he saw slavery as critical to that.
It's also fascinating because if you go back to Thomas Jefferson's unadopted Grievance, Jefferson talked about how the colonists actually tried to get King George III to stop defending slavery and to let them do away with the international slave trade. In fact, Jefferson says, quote, "King George III has prostituted his negative, which means his veto power, in suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or to restrain this execrable commerce," end quote. Brooke, you write about this in The Crown Silence as well, that in 1772, Virginia attempted to end the international slave trade to Virginia. And I wonder what prompted Virginians to take this step, because it does seem a bit unbelievable, as Virginia always served as the slave capital of North America. It always had more enslaved people in its population than existed in any other colony or state. So how and why did Virginia try to end the international slave trade in 1772? And why did King George III say no?
And what's so ironic about all of this is that they couched this petition that they end up sending to the king. Essentially, what they're wanting to do is import taxes on enslaved people that will be really high, and that will eventually lead to the decline and eventually kind of do away with the transatlantic slave trade to Virginia. But they say that they're really doing this because it's the right thing to do, it's the moral thing to do. But they have no intention of ending slavery in Virginia or limiting exports from Virginia to anywhere else. And as we know, a domestic slave trade in the 19th century ends up becoming big business in the South, going down into the deep South. And so this argument that they're making is based entirely upon local demographic conditions. They are worried, on the one hand, that the enslaved population is going to continue to reproduce and will ultimately outstrip the native white population. Like, that's one of the main concerns. They've seen it happen elsewhere. They know that places like Jamaica and Barbados, the dominant population is enslaved. But the other reason why I think this whole attempt is somewhat disingenuous is that because they have a population of enslaved people that is self-reproducing, in the language of the day, as they would have said, by, quote, natural increase, not because of importations from the slave trade, they don't need the slave trade. And so because they don't need it, they don't want it anymore. And they want to limit it. But as I was mentioning earlier, they're part of a larger system. They are part of an imperial Atlantic-wide system that has a lot of different players and a lot of different moving parts, and that has a vocal and powerful lobby. So in Britain, there is the West India lobby. It's extremely powerful. There are members of parliament that are involved in the West India lobby. There's major planters that are extremely wealthy. There's merchants. Some of them are members of the aristocracy, or they're well connected to members of the aristocracy, or they have political say. And so they are deeply opposed to any kind of limitations on the transatlantic slave trade. And in addition to the fact that there are vocal members of various outports, so places like Liverpool, which is the main slave trading port, and Bristol, and also London, they're flooding the crown with all of these counter petitions, essentially saying you cannot do away with the transatlantic slave trade. It's going to affect us financially. It's going to have this ripple effect. And so that ends up being the argument that wins the day, because those people are at hand. They're not in a distant colony. And they're also right in the sense that the state itself is benefiting financially from the transatlantic slave trade. And so there are all of these different players who are benefiting in multiple ways. And to limit it at the time would have been seen as a potential attack on different segments of the British economy. So it's interesting because it leads to a somewhat realistic grievance later, which Thomas Jefferson can then rehash, that he can actually point to and say, and on the surface, it does seem as though the king and the British government are actually choosing to, they're not limiting slavery, they're foisting it upon American colonists. But we know that's not the full story, that this is a system that is deeply embedded in colonial society and that will continue to expand into the 19th century when, we don't have George III or anybody else involved associated with the monarchy. And so when you look, obviously hindsight, when you look back on it now, it does seem deeply hypocritical in a lot of ways. But I think that there's a mixture between both real colonial grievances there, which are based on regional concerns. Virginia and kind of the Chesapeake itself was doing well in terms of its population of enslaved people. It didn't need any more people. But in other regions, they were more likely to still want the transatlantic slave trade. So even though Georgia and the Carolinas also had a self-reproducing population, not to the extent that Virginia did. And so part of it has to do with these different regions advancing demographically at different times. And I think that that is also what leads to conflict and different groups supporting the American Revolution or not during the conflict itself. And then even well beyond in the 19th century, when we get to the Civil War, all of these regional variations, which makes American history so rich and interesting, is also what makes it so complicated.
Now, the last part of Thomas Jefferson's grievance on slavery specifically discusses what we now know as Dunmore's Proclamation. And Jefferson stated that King George III, quote, is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, and murdering the people upon whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with the crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another, end quote. Brooke, what were King George III's views on Dunmore's Proclamation of 1775? And was King George III responsible for Dunmore's Proclamation? Did he even know that Dunmore's Proclamation existed?
Yes, and that is really the question. So George III really had nothing to do with Dunmore's Proclamation. Lord Dunmore is making this proclamation in the midst of a conflict for military purposes. And this is very much a strategic, on-the-ground move. We will liberate enslaved people who are owned by the rebels. This will then benefit the British militarily. And so this was absolutely a strategic move. But because he was a royal governor, he was able to do it in the king's name. Eventually, of course, this gets back to London. They don't protest against this, but they don't also embrace it as a larger policy that they want to be happening everywhere. And I think that when you look at that, it's very clear that this is not an ideologically motivated move, that they're not thinking we're going to abolish slavery, we're going to liberate all of the slaves. That is not the goal of this proclamation in any way. And I think that it's been in some ways misunderstood when people think about it now, because I've had people actually say to me things like, well, clearly George III was anti-slavery and Dunmore's Proclamation demonstrates that, and he was just going to free enslaved people. And so this is why Americans had to revolt against the monarchy, because they wanted to maintain their system of slavery. But when you look at what's actually happening on the ground, things are happening in real time. It takes months for some of this news to even get back to London. And so by the time they even find out about it, in some ways it's too late to even do anything about it. But the one thing that I think George III and his advisors were thinking was, we need to be very careful about instituting this as any kind of larger policy because we could alienate the loyalists in America who are actually on our side and some of whom are actually enslavers. They're going to be very uncomfortable with this entire plan, in addition to alienating everyone in the Caribbean colonies. And so there's political concerns about this, there's strategic concerns, and there's also a sense that when you offer freedom to a group of people, you have to then think about what happens next. And I don't think they did in any way. And that's why there's been a lot of studies about what happens to the Black loyalists in particular after the American Revolution. They are dispersed. Some of them go to Nova Scotia. Some of them actually go to places like Jamaica. Thousands of them end up going to London. And when they arrive, there is absolutely nothing in place to receive them. There's no jobs. There's no support. There's no parish relief. There is nothing. And I think that in and of itself really captures how this proclamation and its impact was not something that was well thought out. And it was not something that was part of a much larger military strategy that they had decided in advance. This was just on the ground. How can we win? And I think that that's a key piece of the story to keep in mind, that many things happen on the ground that conflict with maybe what imperial authorities or the crown would prefer.
So, Brooke, now that we've examined the facts and the claims that Thomas Jefferson made in his unadopted grievance about slavery, would you answer the question we started our conversation with? Do you think King George III was to blame for slavery in British North America?
No, I really don't think he is. I don't think he is in the sense that the grievance depicts this relationship. If Thomas Jefferson had written a grievance that instead said that the British monarchy and Parliament had, in all of these different ways, supported slavery, the expansion of slavery, had expanded the transatlantic slave trade, and all the parts that we mentioned earlier about essentially refusing to curb the trafficking of enslaved people in the late 18th century, if he had laid all of that out and said, essentially, this is something that we are now having to deal with, it might make a little bit of sense. But the way instead that he writes the grievance, it completely strips away the responsibility of American colonists. It makes it seem as though they're all innocent, that they have had this system foisted upon them against their will, which we know is not the case, and that they were actually demanding more imports of enslaved people just decades earlier. And so he really, I think, does a disservice to the historical record in his grievance. But at the same time, as you know from my book, I do think that the royal family and the monarchy is responsible for launching England in the transatlantic slave trade. By the 18th century, the Americans, they've got their own responsibility. They have their own role to play in this larger story. And I think that there's a real reason why when they all got together, the delegates, and they looked at this grievance, they thought, this is going to alienate multiple people, but also it's not really true. I would love to have been a fly on the wall in that moment when they're going over that draft.
It's interesting that you mentioned the edits that Thomas Jefferson could have made to his grievance, which would have blamed Parliament and the English monarchy for the slave trade. And while your edits would have been more accurate, it wouldn't really have worked well with the Declaration of Independence if this grievance had ever even been adopted, because Jefferson and Congress framed their 27 grievances as personal. They specifically blamed King George III because Congress wanted to make the colony's separation from the British monarchy, which early Americans loved. They loved the king and the monarch. So they wanted to make this separation from the British monarchy a lot easier for the American people. So they vilified it in the Declaration of Independence.
Right, exactly. And what I love about this whole time period in the 18th century is that you have a bunch of royalists who are kind of obsessed with the monarchy. They are buying all sorts of trinkets. They are celebrating the royal birthdays. It's this culture that is just fascinated with the royals. And then there is just this fervent rejection of the monarchy and everything royal in the era of the American Revolution. And it happened so rapidly. My students are always shocked to realize how kind of in love essentially American colonists were with Britain and with the royals prior to the American Revolution.
And now it's time for us to dive into the time warp. As you may know, this is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Brooke, as I read The Crown Silence, I went down a rabbit hole, and I would like you to join me there. So, in your opinion, what might have happened if King George III had tried to abolish slavery before the American Revolution? Do you think the revolution would have happened, and do you think that this act of abolition might have served as a primary cause for the American Revolution, if King George III had done this?
I think there would have been political, economic, and social consequences, and they would have rippled across the Atlantic. Political consequences in the colonies, I think the southern colonies would have revolted sooner. It's one thing to claim that the king is forcing you to buy enslaved people and all of that disingenuous stuff that Jefferson said and then was scratched. It's another to actually have a monarch, a constitutional monarch who actually doesn't have the authority, come in and say, I'm going to abolish slavery. Yeah, I think that they would have been absolutely outraged, and we would have seen an outbreak of violence potentially much earlier. So that would have been an interesting counterfactual to think about. I think they would have seen it as a royal attack on property rights and as essentially like the Stuarts in the 17th century, pushing the royal prerogative beyond its limits to the point where colonial subjects were being completely stripped of their rights and liberties. So I think that would have been one of the consequences. I also think it would have weakened loyalty elsewhere. So in other parts of the Atlantic Empire, there would have been grave concern. And actually, if the king had been supportive of abolishing slavery, I do think that places like Barbados and Jamaica would have joined the 13 colonies in revolt. So that would have also potentially changed the trajectory of this entire story, which would have made for a great Netflix show if that had happened. And also, I think it would have weakened loyalty even in the northern colonies, because some of the colonies in the north, there are many merchants with links to the transatlantic slave trade or to colonies that profit from slavery. And these are links that take time to dissolve. It would have absolutely affected their economies and their commercial networks. I think there would have also been an impact on Britain's economy and politics. It would have been an economic shock to the imperial system, because by the time the British actually do abolish the transatlantic slave trade in 1807 and ultimately slavery itself in the 1830s, the economy, the empire is shifting. And also more and more imperial interests are moving away from the Atlantic and actually towards places like India, Africa, China, elsewhere in the world. And if this would have happened decades earlier, they would have not already had that in place. So that would have affected a bunch of different sectors of the economy, customs revenue. Also, there would have been political backlash at home. Parliament might have resisted and might have actually seen the king as going over the limits of his constitutional authority, because this would have clashed with entrenched financial interests of many members of parliament. As we know from even looking at the compensation, which was given to enslavers after the British abolished slavery in the 1830s, UCL has created this fantastic database, the Legacies of British Slave Trading. And essentially that database shows on a micro level all of the different members of British society who had interest in slavery. And there are so many, but many of them also were politically powerful or had some role in government. And then one other thing that might be interesting is it might have led to revolts, enslaved revolts and or abolition movements elsewhere. So it could have had an enormous effect in a lot of different ways.
That's a fascinating answer, and I'm going to have to chew on that for a bit. But while we're pitching Netflix our alternate historical reality project,
yes,
as you were talking, the idea that came to my mind was imagining John Adams complaining about the Virginians and South Carolinians because Massachusetts really wanted South Carolina and Virginia to slow down their push for revolution and independence. And of course, that's the fun part, because in reality, Virginia and South Carolina really wanted Adams and Massachusetts to slow down their revolutionary activities.
Right.
Now, you mentioned at the start that you came to the idea for writing The Crown Silence based on the work you did for your first book, A Dark Inheritance. So, Brooke, is your new research project one that has been inspired by The Crown Silence? Would you tell us about it?
Actually, yes. And I'm pretty excited about this project because it's both related to my research thus far and my teaching, but also a real departure. So my next book is going to be historical true crime, and I will be looking at a really fascinating case in Regency England, a series of murders I don't want to mention what they are yet, but essentially it's a case that helps to lead to the birth of the Metropolitan Police in 1829. So this is a precursor case that is connected with the empire. It is connected with the docks and the river police, and also with the Prince Regent himself. So this is a case that I stumbled upon while thinking about empire at home and what was it like and the rise of policing. And so I wanted to write a book that could tie into my interest in empire and monarchy, but also would be fun and interesting. And so there's definitely a true crime element. And so it's exciting to get to write a suspense nonfiction book.
I hope there's going to be a true crime podcast.
That would be cool. Yes, definitely.
We've covered a lot of history today. We kept Thomas Jefferson and the American Revolution as our central focus, but we went all the way back to the 1490s. So, Brooke, we're going to have more questions. Where is the best place for us to reach you to pose them?
I have a website, brookennewman.com, and I have my email on there as well as a contact form. So yeah, please contact me. I'm also on Blue Sky at Dr. Brooke Newman and Instagram.
Brooke Newman, thank you so much for helping us better understand the British monarchy's ties to the slave trade and for helping us explore Jefferson's unadopted grievance about slavery for the Declaration of Independence.
Thank you for having me.
Thomas Jefferson's cut grievance is one of the most fascinating what-ifs in United States history. And as Brooke made clear, the truth it obscured is far more interesting than its accusation against King George III. The British Crown helped launch England's transatlantic slave trade. Through 2 centuries of monopoly charters, investments, naval protection, and customs revenue, the monarchy as an institution grew rich on slavery's profits. This is a story that belongs to the late Tudor, Stuart, and early Hanoverian monarchs alike. But by the time we reach King George III, the picture is far more complicated. A constitutional monarch constrained by Parliament and an entrenched West India lobby, he could not have abolished slavery even if he had wanted to. Plus, the British American colonists had spent more than a century of clamoring for the crown to ship them more enslaved people, not fewer. What Thomas Jefferson's cut grievance really reveals is not a colonial population held captive by a slave trafficking king. It reveals a revolutionary generation looking for a clean break. And some, like Thomas Jefferson, were willing to achieve this clean break with the British Empire by shifting the moral weight of a system that they and their ancestors had built and benefited from onto the monarchy that they wanted to leave behind. Now, as we continue to move through the 250th anniversary year of the United States' independence, Brooke's work is a reminder that the Declaration we celebrate is not the only document that the founders gave us. It's also a document that they didn't give us. And the Declaration that we didn't get from the founders, the cuts they left on Congress's editing room floor, has a great deal to tell us about who early Americans were and how they understood the choices that they were making. You'll find more information about Brooke, her book, The Crown Silence, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/440. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World and you enjoyed learning about this cut grievance, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, after hearing the evidence, where do you come down? Was King George III to blame for slavery in British North America? Or does that grievance belong somewhere else? I'd love to know what you think, so let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Clio Digital Media, and support for this episode comes from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the first historical society founded in the United States in 1791.